3 years after the razors, Vivienne Jade had learned to keep her back straight for a different reason. Not for the stage, but so that no one in the kitchen could see what carrying trays had done to a body built for something else entirely. Outside, a thunderstorm was dismantling the Los Angeles hills with the kind of indifference only weather and powerful men could afford. Inside the Kang estate, the rain meant nothing. The house ran on its own climate, controlled, expensive, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. 41 rooms. Marble that cost more per square foot than Vivienne made in a month. Light fixtures imported from places she had never been and would never go. She had learned the estate's rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of anything that could hurt you, carefully, quietly, without letting it know you were paying attention. She was carrying the Thursday stock reduction when the music started. It came through the East Service corridor wall the way it always did on Thursday nights, muffled by plaster and distance, but unmistakable. Piano. Tchaikovsky. The kind of phrasing that only happened when a pianist understood what they were accompanying wasn't just sound but space. The precise, aching space left open for a dancer who hadn't come in years. Vivienne knew enough about ballet to recognize the exact moment a pianist left space for a dancer who never came. She stopped walking. She did not mean to stop walking. The stock pot tilted. The ladle slid. And in the half-second between stopping and correcting, her right foot moved, just slightly, just the ghost of a releve, weight shifting to the ball of her foot before her brain caught up with her body and cancelled the instruction. Stop it. She started walking again. If you are watching this story for the first time, stay. Because what happens in this house over the next 8 weeks will make you understand something about survival that most stories are afraid to say out loud. The tray went down on the prep station harder than she intended. Glass and butter. The sound cracked through the kitchen like a small detonation. Jade. Mr. Park, kitchen manager, 12 years in the Kang household, a man who had perfected the art of making staff feel like architectural inconveniences, turned from the stove without hurrying. He didn't need to hurry. Slow was worse. Again, he said. Not a question. I'm sorry. The floor near the corridor is. Kneeling position. Every shard. By hand. The other kitchen staff did not look at her. This was its own kind of mercy, the agreement among the small and powerless not to witness each other's humiliations too directly. Vivienne knelt on polished tile cold enough to feel through her work trousers and began removing glass shards from the melted butter one by one. Her palm caught an edge she hadn't seen. Blood welled up slowly, dark and quiet, the way small wounds did when they didn't think they were being dramatic. Some dreams do not die loudly. They starve slowly in uniforms that smell like bleach. Upstairs, faint and certain, the laughter of gala guests filtered down through the ceiling. Vivienne pressed her palm against her apron and kept working. She always slowed near the ballroom doors on Thursday nights. Had done it for 6 months without once crossing the threshold. The music would start and her feet would find reasons to linger, a tray to adjust, a surface to wipe, 30 seconds of stillness in the service corridor with her forehead almost touching the wall and the piano on the other side of it filling up something she had spent 3 years trying to empty out. She never went in. She was very careful about never going in. 2 floors above the kitchen, Kang Joon-ho walked the east corridor toward his private office with the purposeful stillness of a man whose attention was a resource he allocated rather than distributed freely. His phone was in his hand. His mind was already in the meeting that would happen in 11 minutes. The corridor was a route, not a space. The people in it were functions, not faces. He passed the service stairwell without looking down. He did not see her. But on the other side of the ballroom wall, his mother stood at the center of her dance floor with her eyes closed and both hands raised, and paused. Not from fatigue. From something else. The particular stillness of a person who suddenly senses they are not entirely alone. She lowered her hands slowly. She stood there for a long moment in the warm chandelier light, listening to the corridor on the other side of the wall. Then she finished her piece alone, as she always did. But the next morning, she found the butler before breakfast and asked him one question in the careful, precise English she reserved for things that mattered. Who is the girl that stops breathing outside my ballroom? 5:45 in the morning, and Vivienne was already awake. Not from ambition. Not from habit, exactly. More from the vigilance of someone who had learned that the gap between sleeping and waking was the most honest part of the day, the 3 seconds before your body remembered what your life actually was and calibrated itself accordingly. 3 seconds. Then the arches. The pain was old and well mapped by now. Left foot worse than right, always. The outside edge of her left heel where the bone had been forced into shapes it wasn't made for, year after year, until the shapes became permanent, and the pain became a language she was fluent in whether she wanted to be or not. She wrapped both feet with the compression bandages she kept in the bottom of her work bag, the way she'd been doing since she was 16 years old. Not because it fixed anything. Because doing it meant she could stand. She dressed in the half-dark. Black work shirt. Black trousers. The apron she would tie on in the kitchen because tying it anywhere else, in this room, in her own space, felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. Inside the small closet she shared with no one because no one else wanted this particular room at the end of the East Service wing, on the shelf above the cleaning supplies, there was a shoebox. She had not opened it in 4 months. She knew what was inside the way you knew the contents of wounds, precisely, permanently, without needing to look. 3 photographs. A conservatory ID card. An acceptance letter she had been too proud to throw away and too broken to look at. And underneath those, 2 worn point shoes. The soles reinforced with medical tape. The interior lining carefully removed from both, because the lining was where they had put the razors, and even after 3 years she could not bear the thought of anything hidden in places she couldn't see. She had kept the shoes anyway. She was not ready to explain to herself why. She closed the closet and went to work. The Kang estate required 16 hours of her, 6 days a week, and the estate received exactly what was required and nothing beyond it. She was good at her work in the way that people trained for precision were always good at tasks precision was applied to, efficiently, quietly, without error. Mr. Park had nothing legitimate to say about her performance, and found other things to say instead. This was manageable. What was not entirely manageable was the house itself. 41 rooms. She had been assigned 6 of them. But she had heard all of them. The ballroom she heard on Thursday nights through the east corridor wall. The private office on the 3rd floor she heard through the ventilation, phone calls in Korean, low and steady, the tone of decisions being made that other people would experience as whether. Him. Kang Junho. She had been employed in his household for 6 months. He had passed her in corridors twice and once needed a door opened during a security shift change, had extended his hand for the handle without interrupting his phone call, without looking at her face, with the frictionless efficiency of a man who understood that infrastructure existed to be used rather than acknowledged. He had registered her existence the way he registered the estate's other functioning systems. He had not processed it. This was not unusual. In houses like this, staff were infrastructure. You noticed the plumbing when it failed. You did not notice it otherwise. What was unusual, what Vivienne noticed and did not examine too closely because examining it felt dangerous, was the Thursday night music. And the way it had begun to reach further down the corridor than it used to. As if the door was being left open slightly more each week. As if the sound was being aimed somewhere. She told herself it was acoustics. She told herself this with the conviction of someone who knew they were lying. Staff gossip reached her the way it reached all quiet people, not through participation but through proximity. She heard things because she was easy to talk around. And what she heard, on the Wednesday before the Thursday that would change everything, was this: Junho hadn't stood in the ballroom doorway while his mother danced in over a year. Had stopped, suddenly, without explanation. His mother danced alone now, every Thursday, in a room her son no longer entered. Vivienne absorbed this the way she absorbed most information about the family she worked for, carefully, without reaction, filing it somewhere she would not deliberately look for. That Thursday night, the music started at 9. For the first time in 6 months, Vivienne stopped walking when it began. She stood in the east corridor with a clean stack of pressed linens in her arms and both feet very still on the marble floor. She stood there for 47 seconds. She counted. Then she walked on. Madame Kang Soo-yeon had been watching the girl's hands for 2 weeks before she said anything. It was the silver trays that gave it away. The kitchen staff polished them every Wednesday morning, kneeling at the prep station with cloths and solution, working in small circles the way Mr. Park had trained them. The others polished mechanically. Vivienne polished like she was choreographing something, her left hand making the support frame, her right moving in clean arcs with a precision that had no business being applied to silverware. And twice, while her mind was somewhere the rest of her hadn't caught up with yet, her fingers marked time against the tray's edge. 4 counts. 8. A pattern. Old dancers recognized each other the way wolves recognize blood. Madame Kang waited until the others had carried the finished trays out, and then she spoke. Prokofiev or Tchaikovsky? Vivienne went very still. The stillness of someone found somewhere they thought they were hidden. I'm sorry, Madame Kang. I don't. Don't what? The older woman's English was precise and unhurried, shaped by decades of American living layered over something older. She was seated at the kitchen's small corner table with her morning tea, wearing a soft charcoal wrap and the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to find pretense tedious. You don't know them? Or you don't want me to know that you know them? Vivienne said nothing. The silence answered for her. Sit down, please. I have the east rooms too. Sit down. She sat. Madame Kang looked at her for a long moment, not gathering information. The gathering was already complete, but letting the other person know it. Prokofiev, Vivienne said finally. Quietly. For preference. The older woman smiled. Just slightly. Just enough. Come. I'll show you something. The ballroom in the east wing was not the room you expected. From the corridor it announced itself as impressive. Tall arched doors, carved molding, the faint smell of rosin and warm wood that clung to spaces that had housed serious practice. But inside, the impressiveness fell away into something different. Something lonelier. The chandeliers were magnificent. The mirrored back wall was floor to ceiling and 17 feet wide. The hardwood floor was pale honey herringbone, buffed to a reflective finish that doubled the chandelier light and made the room feel larger and somehow emptier at once. A bar ran along the mirror. A speaker system built into the walls. Fresh flowers, white and pale gold, replaced every Thursday whether or not anyone was watching. It was a room that had been loved and was still being maintained. The combination of those two things in the absence of a real audience was the saddest kind of beautiful Vivienne had ever seen. Madame Kang moved to the center of the floor, dropped into a precise demi-plie at the bar, and straightened again. At 63 her form was not what it had been. But the intention behind the form was immaculate. The memory of technical excellence operating through a body that had aged without losing its understanding of what it was doing. Vivienne stood at the ballroom entrance with her hands folded over her apron. She watched the older woman's porte de bras with the expression of someone trying not to cry in public. I came to America when I was 9, Madame Kang said, not looking at her, moving through a slow adagio combination. My father was a businessman. My mother enrolled me in ballet 3 weeks after we arrived because she believed discipline and beauty were the fastest route to belonging. A pause. A controlled turn. She was wrong about belonging. She was right about the rest. She stopped and looked at Vivienne directly. I danced with my husband for 11 years before the business became what it became. Before violence required his full attention. Before his full attention to violence consumed him. She said this without grief, just fact, long digested. He used to stand in that doorway. She nodded toward the arched entrance where Vivienne stood. He watched me every Thursday night until he couldn't anymore. Then he stopped coming. He said it was the only room in this house that still expected something good from him. And he couldn't afford to want that. The room held the silence. Vivienne's hands, folded over her apron, tightened fractionally. My son is very like his father, Madame Kang said quietly. In the ways that matter and the ways that don't. She returned to the bar. ran one more combination. Then she looked at Vivienne with the directness of a woman who had long since stopped wasting words. "You stand like someone who misses flying." Vivienne opened her mouth, closed it, left the ballroom without answering. But that night, alone in her East Service wing room with the shoebox on the shelf above the cleaning supplies, she sat on the edge of her bed for a long time listening to her own breathing. And did not, for the first time in 3 years, actively work to stop hearing music in her head. 10 days before the Kang Foundation Gala, the estate swallowed itself. Every corridor became a logistics route. Every surface became a staging area. Florists arrived Tuesday. The security overlay, men who did not carry themselves like hired help because they were not hired help, appeared Wednesday. By Thursday the kitchen had tripled its staff, and Vivienne had been given a new assignment printed on cardstock and slipped under her door at 6 in the morning. Ballroom serving rotation. Ms. V. Jade. Full event duration. She read it twice. Madame Kang had requested her specifically. Mr. Park had been informed and communicated his awareness to Vivienne with the expression of a man who resented information he couldn't argue with. Vivienne filed it where she filed most things and went to work. The gala was the kind of event that required you to be invisible and presentable simultaneously. The performance of educated non-existence that service staff in powerful houses understood without being taught. She had done it before, in other houses, in other cities, back when she was first learning that the world had more than one kind of stage and some of them had no lights. She could carry a tray through a room full of architects of other people's suffering and betray nothing. The guest list arrived in fragments through the kitchen's intelligence network, overheard phones, catering briefings, the constant invisible labor of people who were supposed to have no opinions about what they knew. Hollywood money. Korean investment groups operating through names that required research to trace to their origins. 3 elected officials who had no business sharing a room. And the foundation donors. Old Los Angeles wealth that had been old long enough to have forgotten how it was made and therefore felt comfortable attaching itself to the word philanthropy. Harrison Lowe was among them. His connection to the Kang Foundation was not ideological, it was transactional, the kind brokered through mutual business interests that predated Jun Ho's restructuring of the family's public face. He was on 3 charitable boards this year. The Kang Foundation was the most useful. When his name reached the kitchen, Vivienne set down the glass she was polishing and stood very still for 11 seconds. Then she picked up another glass and kept working. The rich always believed disasters announced themselves loudly. The worst ones arrived in silk. Backstage in the ballroom's antechamber, the situation was deteriorating with quiet velocity. The violinist contracted to accompany Madame Kang's introductory performance had arrived with shaking hands and the pallor of someone whose anxiety had overtaken his technique 2 hours ago. His accompanist was attempting to calm him in German. It was not working. The house pianist, brought in as general accompaniment support, watched from the corner with the alert stillness of a professional preparing to solve a problem he hadn't been hired to solve. Jun Ho knew about the violinist. He had assessed it as manageable and allocated it to the house manager. He had assessed the evening's primary tension correctly, 4 syndicate-adjacent investors sharing a ballroom for 3 hours with enough champagne to loosen the agreements keeping them from each other's throats. That was the real event. Everything else was stagecraft. He stood at the entry to the East Ballroom corridor in his black suit, no tie, collar closed, the dragon tattoo ending precisely at his collar's edge, and ran the room with the cold efficiency of a man who had learned that caring about the wrong things was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. His mother appeared at the far end of the corridor in a deep sapphire gown, moving with the straight-backed grace that age had not taken from her. She was walking toward the ballroom floor alone. The violinist had not recovered. The orchestra was stalling. Jun Ho started toward her. She looked at him once, briefly, with the calm of a woman who had already decided what was going to happen. Then she walked through the ballroom doors anyway. He stopped at the threshold. On the serving floor, silver tray in hand, white apron tied at her waist, Vivienne watched Madame Kang step onto the dance floor in front of 200 people with no accompanist, no partner, and no hesitation. And then she watched Madame Kang's left knee buckle. The tray left her hands. She didn't decide. Her body made the calculation before her mind arrived at the question. 12 feet of open ballroom floor. Vivienne crossed it in the time it took the nearest guest to pull breath for a gasp that never finished forming. Her hands found Madame Kang's waist and shoulder simultaneously. Weight redistribution. Automatic, exact, the instinct of someone trained to catch and be caught across a decade of partnered work. The older woman's balance returned instantly. Not because she grabbed something. Because something that understood her held her. For 1 second, they were still. The orchestra hung in its stalled silence. 200 people held their breath. Then the house pianist, reading the room with the fast intelligence of a musician who had survived many difficult nights, made a decision. His hands found the opening bars of the Sleeping Beauty Adagio. A beat later, the violinist, steadied by necessity rather than nerve, found the melody line and joined him. And Madame Kang, balanced and steady, looking at Vivienne with an expression that contained years of Thursday mornings and a question she had already known the answer to, began to move. Vivienne's body moved with her. She did not choose this. The music asked. Her body answered. The arabesque unfolded the way lungs expand, not with effort but with the mechanics of a thing doing what it was made to do. Right leg extending. Spine lifting. Left arm curving outward in a clean port de bras while the right reached forward and upward along a diagonal that the room could feel was correct before anyone could explain why. The apron moved with her. White cotton against black work trousers. The apron strings trailing slightly with the momentum of a turn. Her flat kitchen work shoes on hardwood built for satin and leather. The contradiction was so complete it became a different kind of truth. She didn't look at the audience. She wasn't there for the audience. She was there because the music had found something she'd buried under 3 years of concrete and silence and flat-soled shoes, and it had pulled without asking permission, and she had run out of reasons to resist before she'd even identified the moment resistance stopped working. The room understood before she did. A woman near the center tables pressed her fingers to her mouth. A Korean investor who had been checking his phone placed it face down on the table without looking away. 3 members of the wait staff at the perimeter had stopped pretending to move. Jun-ho entered the ballroom. He stopped 4 steps past the threshold. He had been mid-sentence on his phone. The sentence ended. The phone lowered. He stood completely still in his black suit, dragon at his neck, hands at his sides, and watched a woman in a kitchen apron execute a developed sequence with the technical precision of someone who had sacrificed years to earn it, and watched her do it with her eyes half closed, and her face entirely unguarded, every wall she had built across 6 months of his household completely dissolved. She did not know he was there. This was the part that stayed with him. Not the technique. Not the revelation of a race talent working in his own kitchen. The part that stayed was that she wasn't doing it for anyone. She had simply forgotten that anyone existed. The adagio reached its long sustained note. Madame Kang and Vivienne moved through the final phrase together, the older woman's form quieter now, following, her expression the undisguised joy of someone who had found, after a decade of dancing alone, someone who spoke her language. The music ended. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the silence before. From the center of the room, Harrison Lowe, tailored gray suit, the smile of a man who specialized in acquiring things, leaned toward his companion and said it at a volume designed to travel exactly far enough. Jesus Christ! A pause. That's Vivienne Jade! Jun-ho did not applaud. When the room rose, not all at once but in the rolling motion of people who had forgotten they were performing and were simply responding, he stood where he was with both hands at his sides and watched Vivienne Jade remember herself in front of 200 people who had no idea what they were witnessing the cost of. His mother turned toward the audience with the composure of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing when she walked onto that floor alone. Vivienne stood beside her in a kitchen apron, her chest rising and falling. Her face still open, still unguarded, still wearing the expression of someone who had not yet fully returned from wherever the music had taken her. Then awareness came back. You could see it arrive. The small recalibration. Eyes focusing on the room. The horror of a person who has forgotten themselves in public, and is now counting the witnesses. Her hands found the apron strings. She stepped back. Junho watched her step back and said nothing. He crossed to his head of security and spoke quietly. "Clear the dance floor perimeter. Get the guests back to dinner." His voice was exactly what it always was. No one in that room would have known. He did not look at Vivienne again that evening. This was a decision. He was already making other ones. Near the east kitchen corridor, Mr. Park had watched the ballroom scene from the serving threshold with the expression of a man whose categories had failed him. He had managed Vivienne Jade for 6 months as a quiet, adequate kitchen worker with unfortunate tendencies toward distraction. What he had just watched did not fit inside the file he had built for her, and the file was the instrument of his authority. And an instrument that no longer fit its subject was no longer an instrument of authority at all. He said nothing to her during cleanup. He said nothing the following morning. On the 3rd day after the gala, he transferred her formally to household general staff, a lateral move that took her out of his kitchen and out of his jurisdiction, and submitted the paperwork without explanation. Whatever Vivienne Jade now was in this house, she was no longer his problem to contain. She was not informed of the transfer's reason. She did not need to be. The estate settled around midnight. The last car left at 12:47. The kitchen staff worked through cleanup in the exhausted silence of people who had been performing invisible labor for 6 hours and had nothing left to perform. Vivienne washed glasses. She was precise about it. Precision was the one thing that still belonged to her unreservedly, and the evening had taken something from her reserve she was not yet sure she could replace. Nobody spoke to her directly. But she felt the shift in the room the way you felt weather, not through one sensation but through the accumulation of small signals. The wider space left around her at the sink. The way 2 of the serving team had looked at her during cleanup with expressions she couldn't fully decode, not unkind, but altered. As if they were recalibrating a measurement they had taken months ago, and were now discovering had been wrong. Harrison Lowe had said her name. She kept returning to that. He had said it at a volume designed to travel, and it had traveled, and now her name, the name she had carefully not used in this house, in this city, in this rebuilt life, was loose in a room full of people with excellent memories and various reasons to find information useful. She dried the last glass and went to her room. She did not open the shoebox. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall, and thought about the relève in the corridor 6 months ago. The one she had cancelled before it completed. The one that had been, she understood now, the first failure of a containment system that had been failing slowly for months before the music finally found the crack wide enough. She had spent 3 years becoming someone who did not dance. It had taken 40 seconds of Sleeping Beauty to prove the project had never actually worked. Junho was in his office at 1 in the morning with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched and 3 open files he wasn't reading. He had sent 2 messages. The first to his private intelligence contact in the arts community. The second to the team that handled background on anyone who had moved through his household in ways he hadn't fully processed at the time of their arrival. He was not a man who left gaps in his information. Vivienne Jade had been a gap for 6 months, and he had not noticed because she had presented as a function, kitchen staff, east wing rotation, unremarkable performance record, no flag. He had registered her. He had not processed her. He understood now that this distinction had been the error. He picked up the whiskey. Set it down without drinking. He had spent years mastering the art of reading weakness. Vivienne confused him because what she hid was not weakness at all. It was the opposite, buried so deliberately and maintained so precisely that his entire system for evaluating the people in his household had registered the concealment as emptiness rather than as what concealment always meant, that something inside was worth protecting. He did not know yet what had required that level of protection. He would by morning. What destabilized him more than the dance itself, more than the technical revelation of what had been working in his kitchen unremarked for 6 months, was the sound coming from his mother's rooms when he passed them in the corridor at 11 o'clock. Her real laugh. Not the social version she deployed at events like a well-maintained instrument. The real one. The one he had not heard since before his father's last year. Coming through the door, unhurried, genuine, belonging to a woman who had just had an evening she had not expected. He stood in the corridor outside her door for a moment, then continued to his office. At 2:17 in the morning, an envelope appeared under his door. He crossed the room and picked it up. Inside, a single photograph, printed on plain paper, pulled from a digital archive. A stage. Bright performance lighting. A young woman mid-grand jeté, suspended, fully extended, the line of her body so technically correct it looked structural rather than human. Her face was turned slightly toward the wings. Even at that angle, turned away mid-air, the face was Vivienne's. He placed the photograph in the center of his desk, squarely, and went back to the window. He stood there for a long time looking at the hills. The file came in 3 parts over 48 hours. Jun-ho read it standing at his desk rather than sitting, because sitting implied a duration he wasn't ready to commit to before he understood what he was dealing with. Part 1 was the career record. Vivienne Jade, born Los Angeles. Enrolled in classical ballet training at age 6 through a scholarship program at a Compton Community Arts Center. Identified early. Accelerated. Transition at 14 to the Pacific Arts Conservatory on full scholarship, the first student from her program to make that transition in 11 years. Training record, exceptional. Performance history, significant. By 20 she was principal track. By 22 she was being discussed in the quiet way the Los Angeles arts establishment discussed people it was preparing to present to the world. Part 2 was the gala. The conservatory's annual showcase. 3 years ago. The public record described it in the careful, deniable language of institutions protecting themselves, an incident involving another performer, a safety failure, injuries sustained requiring medical attention. The private record said, razors. Placed inside the lining of her pointe shoes. Both shoes. Not one, both, which meant it was not careless damage, but considered, deliberate, and designed to maximize. She had put the shoes on in the dressing room. She had warmed up in the wings. She had not understood what was happening until she was already on stage and the damage was already being done. She had finished the first variation. Jun-ho stopped reading at that line. 11 seconds. She had finished the first variation. Bleeding on stage, in front of an audience that could not see inside the shoes. She had finished it because she was trained to finish things, and because some part of her, some part that clearly had not diminished in the 3 years since, was simply not built to stop in the middle of something she had started. She had collapsed in the wings after the curtain. Part 3 was the aftermath, and this was where Jun-ho's jaw tightened with the controlled tension of a man who recognized a particular kind of work when he saw it. Harrison Lowe, chairman of the Pacific Arts Conservatory Board. His investigation into the incident had been thorough in the way investigations were thorough when the person conducting them was primarily interested in determining what story was survivable. The performers present in the dressing room that night were interviewed. Their accounts were consolidated into a version that named no individuals and attributed the incident to a general breakdown in event management. The scholarship funding Vivienne's training was restructured the following month. The restructuring eliminated her category of eligibility. This was presented as a budget decision. Within 6 months, the quiet, efficient, devastating process of making someone's name difficult to say in professional rooms had completed its work. Callbacks that didn't come. Recommendations that went unanswered. Auditions where the decision had already been made before she walked in, for reasons that were never stated because they never needed to be stated. In Los Angeles, powerful men rarely buried women with dirt. They buried them with silence. And when the silence finished its work, Vivienne Jade had left the city she was made in and spent 2 years in 3 other cities learning how to be someone who had never danced, before arriving in his kitchen 6 months ago, taped arches, a shoebox she didn't open, and a face so carefully neutral it had taken his mother less than 2 weeks to find the truth inside it. Jun-ho closed the file. He made a call that had nothing to do with Vivienne and everything to do with Harrison Lowe, and when it ended he sat in the silence of his office and felt something that was not quite anger, though anger was present, cold and purposeful as it always was when he identified something requiring a response. Something more personal than anger. Something that had arrived through the photograph on his desk and declined to leave. 3 weeks passed before he acted on it. He moved carefully when the target was someone with the kind of visibility that required precise handling. Then he acted. His mother found him at dinner the evening after the first move was made. She sat with both hands folded on the table and her posture impeccably straight. She looked at him. "Will you let them erase her twice?" "No," he said. It was the first time she had heard him say that word and mean something other than operational refusal. Nobody announced the change. It simply became true. The first Thursday after the gala, Vivienne appeared at the ballroom doors at 9 o'clock with no instruction from anyone, and Madame Kang looked up from the bar and said simply, "Prokofiev tonight, I think," and pressed play, and that was the entirety of the negotiation. They danced for 2 hours. Not performance. Not formal practice. Something closer to conversation in the only language they held fully in common, bodies that understood music as structure rather than decoration, that heard phrase lengths as architecture and responded accordingly. Madame Kang's range was quieter now than it had been in youth. Vivienne adjusted without comment, leading where the older woman needed leading, following where she wanted to set the direction, reading the physical exchange with the fluency of someone who had partnered for years. After, they sat at the edge of the stage in comfortable silence. Madame Kang with a glass of water. Vivienne with her compression bandages in her lap, rewrapping her left arch the way she did every night. The older woman watched her do it without comment. Then she said quietly, "You are allowed to be careful and still be present." Vivienne didn't answer. But she came back the next Thursday. By the third Thursday, the ballroom door had been left slightly open. This was not an accident. Madame Kang did not leave things accidentally. By the fourth, 2 kitchen staff had found reasons to be in the east corridor at 9 o'clock. Then 3. By the fifth Thursday, the security guard at the East Wing Junction had stopped pretending to look at anything except the thin line of warm light and sound coming through the gap in the doors. Nobody said anything. It was understood that something was happening in that room worth being near. The household changed around the Thursday nights the way households changed around things that mattered, not through announcement but through accumulation. Madame Kang ate breakfast fully. Requested fresh flowers for the ballroom twice a week. Laughed during tea. Her physician, who visited monthly, noted the improvement in her mobility and commented on it to the housekeeper, who mentioned it to no one else because there were things in this house you observed without reporting. Vivienne's feet still hurt every morning. This did not change. But she had stopped counting how many seconds she stood in corridors. She noticed the absence of the counting the way you noticed the absence of a sound you had grown so accustomed to you had stopped hearing it as sound and started hearing it as silence. She had forgotten that joy made noise until she heard his mother laughing across the ballroom again. Junho came on the 6th Thursday. He did not enter. He stood in the doorway, both hands at his sides, weight evenly distributed, with the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not intended and found it unexpectedly difficult to leave. He watched for the duration of 1 full piece. Then he was gone before Vivienne turned around. He came back the 7th Thursday. And the 8th. On the 9th, he arrived midway through the 2nd piece and stayed for the rest of the session. He stood in the same position as always, threshold, not inside, hands at his sides, and watched his mother move through a slow adagio combination with the straight-backed intention of someone who had not stopped believing in the form even as the years asked more of her body than her body always wanted to give. He watched Vivienne watch his mother. And something in his expression, in the controlled geometry of his face, shifted by a fraction that would have been invisible to anyone who had not been paying attention. Vivienne had been paying attention for 9 weeks. After the music ended, while Madame Kang adjusted the speaker for the next piece, Vivienne crossed the floor to the doorway. Stopped 2 feet from where he stood. Looked at him the way she had learned to look at things that could hurt her, with full attention, without flinching. "Why do you keep coming?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he would give her nothing. He was a man who gave nothing by default and something only when the calculation supported it. Then, because my mother sounds alive again. Flat. Direct. No decoration. Information offered not as warmth but as fact. She had learned that from Kang Jun-ho. Information was the warmth. It was the closest he came. She nodded once. Went back to the center of the floor. The music started again. He stayed in the doorway until the final note resolved. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Formal cardstock, announcing its seriousness to wait before you read a word. The Pacific Arts Conservatory. Spring Foundation Gala. 40th Anniversary. You are invited to perform as a featured artist. Vivienne read it 3 times. Turned it over. There was nothing on the back. She found Madame Kang in the east sitting room. The older woman read it without expression. Set it on the table between them. Folded her hands. My son arranged it. How? The way he arranges things. Vivienne looked at the conservatory seal. The institution that had taken 11 years of her life and then the life itself, and watched her disappear with no more concern than a man watching water drain. Harrison Lowe will be there. His seat on the board is being addressed, Madame Kang said. My son is thorough. The people who were in that dressing room will be there. Yes. Vivienne held the invitation. Outside, the Los Angeles hills were dark. I'll need new shoes, she said. Yes, said Madame Kang. You will. Backstage at the Pacific Arts Conservatory smelled exactly the same. Rosin and hairspray and warm stage lighting on old wood. 3 years and it was identical. Her body catalogued it before her mind did. She stood in the wings in new point shoes. She had checked the lining herself. Both shoes. Every seam. Twice. Her hands were shaking. Through the gap in the stage curtain, Harrison Lowe, 3rd row. The conservatory board flanking him. Faces she knew. Faces that had looked through her for 3 years the way you look through windows you didn't intend to open. A conservatory official appeared at her shoulder. Young. Visibly uncomfortable. Clipboard. Ms. Jade. There's been a change to the program order. She waited. Mr. Lowe has requested the featured slot be reassigned. The wings went quiet. A stagehand nearby stopped moving. On what grounds? Vivienne said. He cited concerns about. A door opened at the back of the wings. Kang Jun-ho walked in. Black suit. No tie. Dragon at his neck. The expression that was not an expression. Absolute controlled stillness that made rooms recalibrate without instruction. He looked at the official with the clipboard. 1 second. 2. The official closed his mouth. Jun-ho looked at the stage manager. The program stands. Nobody argued twice. The stage manager appeared at Vivienne's elbow. 2 minutes, Ms. Jade. Jun-ho stepped beside her. Close enough to speak quietly. He did not touch her. You don't have to be perfect, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said. The curtain rose. She walked into the light. The first step was the hardest thing she had done in 3 years. The second was easier. By the third she was in position and the pianist had found the opening phrase and her body had recognized it the way her body recognized everything it had been trained to do, not with thought, but with the absolute, pre-verbal certainty of a thing returning to its purpose. She breathed. She began. The first variation was not perfect. Her left ankle gave slightly at the inside edge. She felt it. Absorbed it. Kept moving the way she had always kept moving, not because she was fearless but because she was trained, and training meant knowing the body had more in it than fear believed. The second variation was better. By the third, the stage belonged to her. Not reclaimed. Not fought for. Simply acknowledged. By the floor beneath her feet, by the light above her, by the specific quality of silence from 200 people who had stopped performing their own attendance, and were simply present. Harrison Lowe was in the 3rd row. She did not dance for him. She did not dance against him. She danced because the music asked and her body answered. 3 years of razors and silence and kitchen floors and 47 seconds counted in a corridor. None of it had taken that answer from her. The final phrase arrived. She met it. The curtain fell. Silence. Then the first sound, not applause, something before applause, a room inhaling. From the 4th row, in a deep sapphire dress, Madame Kang. Straight-backed, unhurried, rising with the precision of a woman who knew exactly what deserved to be honored. From the back row, Junho. Still uncertain, unfolding to his full height without performance or hesitation. Then the room. In the rolling, uncontrolled way that meant it was real. Vivienne stood in the light and let it happen. The stage they took from her said her name again. 6 months later, the ballroom was the loudest room in the house. Twice a week, 8 scholarship students from 3 Compton community programs came to the Kang estate, and were taught ballet by Vivienne Jade and Madame Kang Suyun on a floor built for exactly this. The program had no formal name yet. It had waiting lists. This had been Madame Kang's idea. Junho had funded it without being asked twice. The loop that had opened in this story's first chapter. Why did Vivienne Jade willingly disappear from the life she was born for? Had its answer now. She had not disappeared willingly. She had been buried by people with the power to bury her, and she had survived by making herself small enough not to be found again. Until a Thursday night and a thunderstorm and 40 seconds of sleeping beauty had reached through the concrete and pulled. She had not been hiding. She had been waiting, in the only way available to her, to be worth finding again. One evening after the students had gone, Vivienne stood alone in the ballroom before turning off the lights. She crossed to the closet where the estate stored spare equipment, and retrieved a shoebox she had placed there 3 months ago. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on the shelf, not hidden above cleaning supplies, not behind anything. Just placed there, visible, in a room that was now hers to use. She didn't need to open it. She knew what was inside. She knew she wasn't going to throw it away. She also knew she was no longer keeping it out of grief. She turned off the lights and walked out, leaving the door open behind her the way Madame Kang always had. In the corridor, Junho was waiting. Not blocking. Not hovering. Simply present, in the way he had learned to be present, which was to say, without performance, without agenda, with the patient stillness of a man who had decided that something was worth standing near and was prepared to stand there. She fell into step beside him. Either of them spoke. They walked the east corridor together, past the wall where she had stood for 47 seconds once, counting, past the service stairwell he had descended without looking down, through the house that had been 41 rooms and 6 of them hers and none of them facing the garden. The music wasn't playing. She didn't flinch at the silence. She had taken the long way back to herself. But she had arrived. If you are new here, click on the subscribe, click on the like and share button as well. A new story drops tomorrow.